I'm joined now by a member of President Trump's legal term, Jay Sekulow, the chief counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice. Jay, good to see you as always. Happy Father's Day.
Good to see you. Happy Father's Day to you, Jay.
Thank you so much. So, should we take that tweet from the president as confirmation that the president is under investigation?
Let me be clear, the president's not under investigation. As James Comey said in his testimony, that the president was not the target of investigation on 3 different occasions. The president is not a subject or target of an investigation. That tweet was in response to a Washington Post story that ran with 5 unnamed sources without identifying the agencies they represented, saying that the special counsel had broadened out his investigation to include the president. We've had no indication of that. The president was responding to that particular statement from the Washington Post, again, with 5 anonymous sources.
Right.
And again, without even identifying the agency. So, no, the president's not under investigation, has not been.
So the president said, I am under investigation, even though he isn't under investigation?
That response on social media was in response to the Washington Post piece. It's that simple. The president is not under investigation.
Well, I wish it were that simple, but with all due respect, the president said, I am being investigated in a tweet, and people take his word on that. But you're his attorney. You're saying that the president, when he said that, was not accurate.
No, the president it was 141 characters. There's a limitation on Twitter, as we all know. And the president is a very effective utilization of social media. So here's what you have. The president issued that tweet, that social media statement, based on a fake report, a report with no documented sources from the Washington Post. And I want to focus on that for one moment. Isn't it ironic that a leak would take place by 5 anonymous sources saying that the special counsel had increased the scope of their investigation, and they don't even identify the agencies upon which those individuals were speaking? So the president's response, I want to be crystal clear here, the president's response was as it related to the Washington Post report. He cannot, in a Twitter statement, include all of that in there. But the Washington Post statement came out that morning.
So the president
there should be no confusion. No confusion. The president is not under investigation.
But it is confusing because the president said, I am being investigated. And you're saying that the Washington Post report is wrong, but no one did more to confirm the Washington Post report than the president. I mean, CNN had not confirmed the Washington Post report, but then President Trump came out and said, quote, I am being investigated. So the confusion, I mean, is this not frustrating for you as an attorney to have a client that is sharing information with the world that's not accurate?
Look, this is a president that has utilized social media, that has revolutionized the whole concept of electioneering when it comes to the use of social media. He's able to communicate with 107 million people on his various social media platforms on a regular basis as he needs to. So he can directly reach a lot of people. That statement, again, was in response to the Washington Post. So let me be clear. The Washington Post story was based on 5 anonymous sources.
Right.
Doesn't even identify the agency. So that's it. Simple explanation.
Okay. I mean, I don't think it's simple, but I don't think we're getting anywhere, so let me move on. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who is a close Trump ally, spoke on Friday at the National Press Club. Let's run a clip of what he said.
The President of the United States cannot obstruct justice. The President of the United States is the chief executive officer of the United States. If he wants to fire the FBI director, all he's going to do is fire him.
We're going to ignore, for the sake of our conversation, the fact that when Gingrich was Speaker of the House, he voted to impeach President Clinton for obstruction of justice. But let's move on to today. Is it the position of the Trump legal team that the President of the United States cannot obstruct justice because he's the executive? He can fire anyone in the executive branch under the executive branch.
Look, you're talking about what's called the constitutional threshold question, and that is, can a president who has the constitutional authority to take a certain action then be prosecuted for taking the action? In this particular case, you had a scenario where the president, receiving advice from a variety of his government officials, was told by his attorney general and by his deputy attorney general that James Comey should not be leading the FBI. It's ironic that based on the action that they recommended that he took in consultation with others, that he's now being investigated by the agencies that told him to take that very action, removing the FBI director. So this idea, this is the threshold constitutional issue that has to be addressed before anything starts. When we talk about investigations, before you can get to investigation, you got to determine, does the Constitution allow for a prosecution or an investigation even of this type of matter. And there's been memorandums going back to the Office of Legal Counsel in the 1970s and in the 2000s, but there's also the fundamental concept within the Constitution itself. So I think the constitutional issue here is raised first. If there is an investigation, right now there's not, you would of course raise the constitutional issues. Any lawyer, especially those that do it at the Supreme Court of the United States, like I do, you raise the constitutional issue threshold. That's number one.
Well, just as a point of fact, President Trump has already admitted that he had already made his decision long before Rod Rosenstein issued the memo. So whether or not Rosenstein made that recommendation, it was irrelevant, according to the president, about his decision. But in terms of whether or not the president can obstruct justice by telling people under him what to do or firing them, I lived through the 90s. I'm old enough to remember people on the right saying that President Clinton obstructed justice by telling people who worked for him what to do and threatening the investigation into him. And I recall a completely different point of view as to the president's powers.
Well, you're conflating witness tampering, which was some of the concern there, with telling witnesses what to do, with this situation. This is not a situation of witness tampering. This is not a situation of bribery.
No, it's firing the guy in charge of the investigation.
Well, look, the Constitution is, I mean, this is Constitution 101 here. The president has the authority as the chief executive to make those kind of determinations. James Comey, by the way, stated at his hearing that he understands that he serves at the pleasure of the president. So this is not some complicated case. And by the way, the fact, Jake, that the president consulted with his attorney general and Office of Deputy Attorney General and others, that's called the deliberative process. That's what presidents do when they make decisions that are significant.
I'm just saying that their recommendations were irrelevant according to the president. But I hear what you're saying. But James Comey was fired, according to the president, when he made the decision. He was thinking about the Russia investigation. According to Comey, the president had said to him, I hope you let go this matter relating to Mike Flynn. This is different from the Clinton case without question, but by the same token, the obstruction of justice case is I'm not saying that it's clear cut, but the obstruction of justice case is he was trying to stop an investigation, and when he couldn't get what he wanted, he fired the guy heading the investigation.
But to see, again, and we're friends here, that's conflating two different standards under obstruction of justice.
Sure.
So that's not so you cannot use the comparison. The president has the constitutional authority to deal with those that are subordinates within an administration. That is as clear as the Constitution itself. That is a power vested in the President of the United States. That's number one. Number two, there is no ongoing investigation of the president regarding any of this. James Comey has said that. The only basis of the report is what came out of the Washington Post leaked information. And let's talk about activity. The fact of the matter is, you have a former FBI director, and I want to think about this for a moment, who leaks information that he obtained. He had a conversation with the President of the United States, writes it down on a government computer, in his government vehicle, puts it in his government desk, and then when he's terminated, he leaks it to a friend of his to leak it to the New York Times for the sole purpose, he testifies under oath, for the sole purpose of obtaining a special counsel. That's what needs to be investigated here. I hope there's some pancakes and coffee waiting for you at home. Happy Father's Day again. Thanks so much for coming in. Thank you, Jake. Thanks.